Voters will soon decide who will lead our state for the next 4 years. Tonight on WRAL, hear from the candidates running to be your next governor, where they stand on North Carolina's biggest issues, and what they want you to know before you cast your ballot.
Thank you for joining us for the final debate in the North Carolina governor's race. I'm David Crabtree here with our Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie, and we welcome the candidates, Lon Cecil, Roy Cooper, and Pat McCrory.
Over the next hour, we'll ask them to share their thoughts on a variety of topics, including storm relief, the economy, education, and yes, House Bill 2.
And before we begin, here's some background on the candidates.
Libertarian Lon Cecil entered politics in 2010 when he ran for North Carolina's 12th congressional seat. He's originally from Oklahoma and served in the Army. He has never held elected office. Democrat Roy Cooper is finishing his 4th term as North Carolina's Attorney General. He was first elected in 2000 after serving in both the State House and Senate. He was born and raised in Nash County and graduated from UNC Chapel Hill. Republican Pat McCrory is North Carolina's 74th governor, his term beginning in 2013. He was Charlotte's longest-serving mayor, a record 7 terms. He grew up in Guilford County and graduated from Catawba College.
We have many topics we'd like to cover this evening, and we'd like this to feel more like an open conversation. Each of you will have up to 90 seconds for your initial response to a topic. There's sure to be follow-up questions and discussions, and we're hoping you will talk with each other.
And at the end of the evening, each of you will have a minute for a closing statement. Before the broadcast, as you know, we drew to see who would get the first question, and that first question goes first to Mr. McCrory, then to Mr. Cooper, and then to Mr. Cecil.
One of the primary responsibilities for the next governor is going to be to help the state recover from Hurricane Matthew. If elected, what will you do to make sure the tens of thousands of people who have been directly and dramatically affected are taken care of? Mr. McCrory?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, my prayers are with the 26 people who lost their lives and their families. We're grieving with them, but I'm so proud of the way North Carolina came together in responding to an unexpected hurricane hitting our coast. The thing I'm very proud of my team that I put together was not only did we have a great team that was deployed early and deployed across the state anticipating every type of hurricane scenario, but I'm also very pleased that we had enough money in our rainy day fund to pay for money that we'll have to have in the future to help these people recover. Sadly, the Attorney General just in last month in Lumberton, which was one of the hardest hit cities, spoke against having so much money in the rainy day fund, which would have been a huge mistake had he been governor and we not had sufficient money in the rainy day fund. Of all things, the rainy day fund, and we had the most rain we've ever seen in Lumberton in decades. But the thing I'm putting together, I'm announcing tomorrow a long-term hurricane task force with people from throughout the East, and we're going to look at housing because that's our #1 goal, repairing the infrastructure, water and sewer, and also repairing our roads. And in the short term, my main goal is to get people out of short-term shelters and into permanent housing.
Mr. Cooper.
I grew up in Nash County in eastern North Carolina, and it's unfortunate that people have gotten hit there again. In 1999, we had Hurricane Floyd, and it devastated eastern North Carolina. I was living in Rocky Mount at the time, and I remember Governor Hunt calling and wanted me to meet him at the airport, and I couldn't get there because all of the roads were flooded. As a state senator and Senate Majority Leader at the time, I introduced legislation that provided for hundreds of millions of dollars for relief for eastern North Carolina. And I know what kind of rebuilding process that it takes to make sure we get people back on their feet again. I've been all over eastern North Carolina. I've been talking to people. We need to help them immediately, but it's going to be a matter of weeks and years to make sure we get the housing, to make sure we get businesses going. And this is one of the most difficult places in our state with our economy right now. And Governor McCrory, he knows that I've always supported a strong rainy day fund, and that's where we got the money to be able to help eastern North Carolina before, because I have supported it my entire career. Governor McCrory asked for money from the General Assembly. They passed a bill that provided for $500,000 to defend and bring lawsuits in House Bill 2, of all things, that is earmarked in the Disaster Relief Fund, and Governor McCrory didn't even veto the legislation. What we need is to make sure North Carolina is ready for this. We need a strong leader who knows about rebuilding. We've done it before. Eastern North Carolina is tough. I know, because I grew up there, and we can do it again. We have to.
Mr. Cecil.
I moved here in 1997 and was immediately struck with the flooding from Floyd when that came through. Although heart goes out to all of the citizens of Eastern North Carolina with the flooding again this time, I know that it's just a repeat of a previous flooding, and it indicates a lot of things that weren't corrected the first time. I-95 was closed again. You have to learn from each flood. You have to spend the money to correct those things that happen. And that's going to be money that comes from the taxpayers, one way or another, whether it's federal or state. But we've got to help those people, and a lot of them need a lot of help, definitely.
Everybody's talked about Hurricane Floyd that came through only 17 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I might add that this governor was the one who said this was going to be worse than Hurricane Floyd, and a lot of people mocked me. I might also add that the Attorney General is dead wrong. He hasn't always supported a large rainy day fund. In fact, just 2 weeks ago and a month ago in Lumberton, he stated we have too big of a rainy day fund, and we need to spend more of that money on other things. And thank God we didn't have a governor that had that short-term political aptitude to look at the next election as opposed to the next storm or the next hurricane that is going to hit North Carolina.
Talking about spending money wherever it comes from, a lot of these areas that were hit this time, Princeville being one, Seven Springs, look at Windsor down in eastern North Carolina that's had its share more than just these two storms, or Highway 12 along the Outer Banks. We see destruction happening, we rebuild. Destruction, rebuilding. Should these areas be rebuilt again? Mr. McCrory, we go to you first, and then Mr. Cooper.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Actually, that's part of the long-term plan. In fact, I've talked with Mayor Bobby Jones, who one of the most remarkable men I've ever met at Princeville. His house was underwater, and we're going to have that discussion. If we do rebuild, where and how? And what methods do we use to rebuild? And I think that question needs to be asked in every area that has constant flooding. And that's part of the long-term plan, where I'm going to have engineers a part of this long-term committee. I'm going to have architects. We're going to have environmentalists. We're going to have people who think, what is the long-term sustainable plan on how to rebuild these communities? The most tragic part of these hurricanes is it hits the people who can least afford it. And that's the part that just grabs my heart, is we've got to do everything we can to help those people who can least afford a hurricane, and then make sure our plans are not putting those people in that position again. It's extremely unfair.
Again, Mr. Cooper.
Me? Well, the question is, what kind of leader do you want to help rebuild North Carolina? What kind of governor do you want? And one of the decisions that were made after Floyd is that we did do some mitigation, and there were some places that were not rebuilt, and it was a wise thing because they were flooded again. But clearly we have some places like Princeville and others that were hit twice, and we're really going to have some strong conversations about that. But Governor McCrory talks about people who can least afford it in rural eastern North Carolina, and here he is opposing Medicaid expansion that could help health care in eastern North Carolina. That's all 100% federal dollars that can make a difference in the rural economy. And he's talking now about the people who can least afford it, when we've had ways to help rural eastern North Carolina. And it's time we take a long-term view of this.
Mr. Cecil, should we rebuild those areas?
Some of them will be rebuilt, but we need to learn from the lessons of Katrina. We're not rebuilding in the lowest lands. We're not building flat to the ground. Elevates, make sure we've got the transportation, build homes that, just like we do along the coast. Those houses are built with presumption there's going to be hurricane, the presumption there's going to be another flood. And if they rebuild, it should be with that knowledge. There's a lot of areas that probably should not be rebuilt. People were living there and have lived there for many years because it was low-cost land. And it was low cost because it was subject to flooding.
Let me tell you something else that we just did that you need to know and the audience needs to know is that for those people that were hurt the most, which were the poor, we've extended unemployment benefits. We've helped with food stamps so they can immediately get it. We've cut through the bureaucracy. And we're also going to be helping with other items regarding infrastructure. I've had a great relationship working with President Obama on some emergency relief to make sure Craven County was just added yesterday outside of New Bern and Waynesboro to help more people with cash that can immediately get these poor people clothes and supplies. And I'm very, very proud of our team's leadership.
Okay, Mr. Cooper, very quickly on this, and I want to move on, but it seems like every time Mr. McCrory is making a statement, you're shaking your head.
Well, he talked about extending unemployment benefits. He pushed legislation that made North Carolina's unemployment benefits the most restrictive in the country and did it on the backs of working people. And there are a lot of people in eastern North Carolina looking for work now. And in fact, in over about half of our counties, there are more people looking for work now than they were before the recession. Wow. And what we've got to do is to have a leader who understands that, who's going to have policies that help the working poor, that help the middle class, and not those at the top.
I'll tell you, you got a leader right here. When I came into office, I inherited something from Beverly Perdue, one of Roy's biggest supporters. And it was called a $2.6 billion debt that North Carolina owed the federal government. We borrowed $2.6 billion for unemployment. Had I continued the same program that Mike Easley and Beverly Perdue and Roy had supported, we would be in $4 billion in debt right now. Guess what we did? We've paid off the debt, and now if we have another recession, and by the way, if we need to help these people, we now have $2 billion in reserves in case there's a downturn or in case these people need the extra benefits, which I have extended. That's exactly the strong leadership we need now more than ever, not the old leadership. Spend everything you got and put the debt on future generations.
Gentlemen, we will return to the economy in a future question, but we need to move on here so we get to a few more questions tonight. Staying with Matthew for a moment, we learned last week that floodwaters from Hurricane Matthew carried some coal ash into the News River at Goldsboro. Now, a law signed last year allows coal ash to remain in pits just like the one in Goldsboro at 6 of Duke's 14 sites around the state. Do we need to rethink that decision in the wake of the storm? That question for you first, Mr. Cooper.
Well, one of the things that I'm going to do as governor is listen to the scientists who are providing the advice, unlike Governor McCrory. Governor McCrory's scientists decided that well water that was by families was unsafe, and so they sent a notice to those families that the water was unsafe. And Governor McCrory, for political reasons or the fact that he worked at Duke Energy or for whatever reason, told them to change it. And they rescinded the order. And the chief scientist in the state resigned, saying publicly that she was not going to be part of an administration that deliberately misleads the public. Now, what we need is public officials who are going to listen to scientists, who are going to believe what they say, who act on that, who use data and facts, and don't let their political ideology rule the day, and particularly when you're not being honest with the public, like his administration is, when the top scientist, nonpartisan person with a good-paying job, resigns, and yet another scientist, too, saying that the governor is on the phone talking to his public information officer in the room, telling them to rescind this order. That's wrong, and I'm not going to be that kind of governor.
Mr. McCrory, we'll let you respond to that in just a moment, but let me allow Mr. Cecil to answer this question next.
Over the last 6 months, I've spent a lot of time in the eastern part, looking at the lowlands, going, wow, I see how Hurricane Floyd made so many problems. But the people down there were telling me that their problem is the well water. They don't have water to drink. They are fearful of even using it with their animals. Several of them commented that it was only in June of this year that they finally started getting the bottled water delivered. And the HB 630 law that you talked about that was passed by the legislature contains a provision that they'll have to put in public water lines to certain areas. And the basic date on that is by the end of 2018. And to a person, they will stand there and they will tell me in Goldsboro and Snow Hill and others, they absolutely do not believe in any way, shape, or form those water lines will be put in before 2020, at best.
So do we need to rethink the decision to leave coal ash in pits in other areas? We should point out Goldsboro is one of the that's
Yes.
planned to be excavated, but should we rethink it?
As an engineer, I understand where the problem is going, and the underground water under those things and the surface water near them, particularly the underground water, can never be cleaned. Surface water will clean itself or can be cleaned like they did with the Dan River. But the pits themselves are a continuing hazard, and the only thing we can really do with that is properly mitigate them. But there's a tremendous amount of ash in those things. When you start looking at it and say, well, how many truckloads have we got to haul to a pit to bury it properly, we're going to need some major highways and a lot more trucks.
Understood. Mr. McCrory?
Well, he's right about the engineering and the environmental damage. You can't move them all because you'd actually cause more environmental damage to our state by moving them all. Each individual coal pit is a unique situation, but I've got to correct the record of 3 years of false advertisements by Roy Cooper's super PACs that have been running literally for 3.5 years. You know, coal ash on my hands, as though I did the coal ash spill in North Carolina, which is totally ridiculous. Because what's ironic is I resigned from Duke Energy 6 years ago, 2008. And well, 8 years ago in 2008, and shortly thereafter, Jim Rogers, the CEO and chairman, endorsed Beverly Perdue and gave her a lot of money and gave Roy Cooper a lot of money in 2008 for his reelection as Attorney General. And his job is supposed to help oversight coal ash. There is not one email during his 14 years or 16 years as Attorney General where he has ever expressed concern about coal ash. Not one email. By the way, he only has 14 emails in 14 years. Not one email or not one action taken toward Duke Energy. Now, Duke Energy also, I might add, gave $10 million loan to the Democratic National Convention, which they have yet to pay back. And he has received, during his time as Attorney General, tens of thousands of dollars from Duke Energy and Progress Energy, and during that time took no action, except he did approve some action during the Perdue administration, an email, which we have a record of, which is in the public documents, an email which is approved by the Attorney General's office, which allows Duke to grandfather some of their coal ash ponds from further dam inspection, which had we had that dam inspection, maybe Dan River wouldn't have happened. And second, it also allowed Duke Energy not to have the fine. We wanted to fine them $25 million because of an email approved by the Attorney General's office and Beverly Perdue. We had to pull back that fine based upon lawyers' recommendations. And his lawyers know all about this. Sadly, the commercials don't mention this.
Mr. Cooper.
Your question was about should we excavate. So the state legislature decided they were going to create a coal ash commission made up of experts to make this decision. And the head of the Senate, the Republican leader of the Senate, said, we need this commission because we're concerned about Governor McCrory's ties to Duke Energy and the fact that he had worked there so long. And Governor McCrory sued the state legislature because he wanted sole control over this issue of what happens with the coal ash ponds. Governor McCrory didn't want somebody looking over his shoulder. Now, I've talked about coal ash publicly. Wow. I have a strong environmental record. I've been endorsed by most all of the environmental groups. And to hear Governor McCrory talk about coal ash in my record, the independent fact checkers have said you were wrong every time you said something about that.
Let me first of all, he has not refuted anything I said about the monies he's accepted, about the lack of action he's taken during 14 years. He didn't refute any of that. he changed the subject, which is what Roy Cooper is good at doing, is changing the subject. I'll tell you this, is that Duke Energy did not want, they wanted the Coal Ash Commission. They did not want me to veto the bill. Their lobbyists were all over the House and Senate. I vetoed something they didn't want to veto because it was a bad deal for the people whose water could be impacted by coal ash. I had the courage to veto very important legislation, and I might add, the Senate did not override my veto because they read the details of it and they said, "You're right, Governor, you're right. This would be harmful to the neighborhood that we're talking about in Winston-Salem."
Need to move on again so we can get to some more topics tonight. Our next question goes to Mr. Cecil. There's been a lot said about the Carolina comeback in this election and economic comeback since the recession ended. A recent poll we conducted shows a majority of voters do not feel that they're better off than they were 4 years ago. And in fact, 29% even say they feel that they're worse off. What do you say to those who find themselves still struggling, and how do you intend to help them?
When I moved here almost 20 years ago, the economy was running good, the taxes were high, and things were actually going quite well. It was a long downhill slide rather quickly through 2004, 2008, and a lot of people lost their jobs. I lost my job at one point with that recession. There has been quite a bit of comeback, but it's been very industry specific. The high technologies and the more critical industries have done well with it. Worked with RF Micro in Greensboro with the cell phone industry, and those related electronics and consumer products have come back quite well. A lot of our classic industries that we had, the furniture industry and whatnot, have not come back near as much because they can still get labor and get things done for $1 a day, and they're strictly labor dependent. I think we have made quite a bit of comeback, particularly the last 4 years. I think Governor McCrory's leadership and whatnot has done a good job of getting us recovered. I think we have a long ways to go. I think some of the new taxes have maybe been a little burdensome on the poor people that really couldn't afford much, and to find out they've got to pay sales tax on getting their car repaired really hurt a lot of them.
Mr. McCrory.
Well, what I can say is this. When I came into office 3.5, 4 years ago, North Carolina's unemployment was the 5th highest in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. The 5th highest in the United States of America, 9.4%, adjusted at 8.9%. We've had one of the greatest economic recoveries in the United States of America, down to about 4.7%, down below the national average. I remember after my first year, they were going, "Governor, you still aren't below South Carolina. Our economy is so much better than it was 3 years ago. Is it still good enough? Absolutely not. Is there still more we need to do? Absolutely. But one thing we found out when we were coming into office is we owed $2.6 billion for unemployment. And we were about to tax small businesses more for unemployment. That was the solution of the liberal Democrats. The second thing, we had a $500 million misforecast on Medicaid spending. It was so broken. $500 million misforecast on Medicaid spending. We had the highest income tax and the highest corporate tax and business tax in the Southeast. Even South Carolina was beating us. Nikki Haley even told me, "We don't even consider North Carolina competition anymore." So we had to make some immediate changes, or we could keep trying the same things under my predecessors, Beverly Perdue and Mike Easley. We could have kept trying those things and continued to be the 4th or 5th highest unemployment rate. We have had a great comeback. We need more, but I'm extremely proud of what's happened in North Carolina, and let the progress continue.
Mr. Cooper.
Since the recession, there's been a national economic recovery, but North Carolina is lagging behind. You go ask everyday working people whether they have seen a Carolina comeback, and most of them will tell you they're working longer and harder and for less money than they were before the recession. And the statistics show they're right. Wage growth is languishing in our state, particularly for the middle class. And Governor McCrory comes in and promises everybody a tax cut. Well, he did pretty well for those at the top. He gave the corporations and those at the top good tax cuts. But on everyday North Carolinians, many of them have seen a net tax increase, and that includes small businesses. He has raised taxes on people in 67 different ways. And Governor McCrory is putting more of a burden on the middle class and small business with taxes at a time we need to be helping small business and the middle class. And I will work to do that. I will also work to invest in public education, which is going to be a key. The new economy with the new jobs, our community colleges has got to be the drivers of workforce development. Our universities have to be the centers of innovation. And Governor McCrory, here he is going around and talking about House Bill 2 all over national TV. It is hurting our economy. You talk to economic developers, they will tell you that it's costing us jobs and costing us money. We need a governor who's going to look out for the middle class, and that's what I'm going to do.
Let me ask Roy Cooper a question. Are you going to change the cuts in the income tax and the business tax and corporate taxes that we initiated in the last 3 years, which has resulted in a strong? You were against them. If you were so against them and you want to be the next governor, are you going to repeal it and raise the income tax on every working person who gets a paycheck in North Carolina? It wasn't just for the wealthy, and believe me, you were at Goldman Sachs raising a lot of money in New York City. You know about the wealthy. It was for everyone who earned a paycheck, got a huge reduction, a net increase in pay from school teachers to nurses to independent business people. We were the highest income tax on paychecks.
Well, would you repeal those tax cuts by the
We don't need to increase taxes.
So that is an absolute no.
We do not need to increase taxes.
No.
What we need to do is fix some of those taxes that he put on the middle class and small business and take some of those taxes off of them is what we need to do.
And wait, help me understand the math. If you're not going to repeal it and you're going to change it, ultimately, there's going to be a difference in the income and the tax paid, right?
It's about priorities, David. I mean, the economy is going, I believe the economy is going to grow. There's a national recovery, the economy is going to grow. And over the last 4 years, Governor McCrory